בסדר, זה השפה שלי ואני יכול להסביר את עצמי יותר בשפה האנגלית, אז מחילה אם אתם לא מבינים. So, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and it's amazing to be a really special company here. I'm very humbled, I'm definitely the least qualified, and I'm actually really, I'm excited to learn from this panel as well, and I'm sure many of the things I'll say will be corrected by my eminent panelists when it gets to their turns. So I want to start off just very briefly touching upon three different jurisdictions: Australia, America, and Israel I'm just going to touch upon. And then I'm going to take you through a bit of analysis of understanding why I think those differences exist. So we're going to start with this. We'll start with America because, from a Chutz perspective, it's the most established. America's position on Seiruvin, and I'm not going to take Professor Seimon's speech. He'll talk to you in more detail, but in a regel achat, they permit it. And the general rationale is that there's two arguments you can make against the Seiruv. One is that it makes the arbitration agreement between the two parties void due to duress. So the parties are not signing it voluntarily. And therefore a Seiruv, if you're signing it under the threat of a Seiruv, it's duress. The other argument you can make is that you are preventing free access to the constitutionally enshrined courts. So you've got courts in the country and every citizen has the right to approach those courts, and through a Seiruv you're preventing people from accessing it freely. Levantem? Those are the two main issues. In America, on both of those counts, it has been decided, particularly in the New York sphere, and I'm assuming that's mashpia, but the expert will talk to us, it's been decided that it's not considered duress. It's considered pressure, but legitimate pressure. For example, if I would turn to my brother and say, if you take me to court, I won't talk to you again. That's pressure, but it's not duress, right? I'm not considered blocking his free access to the court by a threat that I won't talk to him again. So the same thing written large, a religious community is able to say, if you do this, you're not in a minyan. You're not able to attend a Bet Sefer Dati, whatever it might be. And that's the American position. The Australian position is the other side of the spectrum. In Australia, there was a case that came up quite recently, and that is when, I'm not going to go into the details because I know I've limited time, but basically there was an individual who was summoned to a Bet Din and declined the summons. The Bet Din issued a Seruv with sanctions, with threatening that that if they don't come, they won't be part of a minyan, all those sort of regular things that are part of a cherem. And this fellow appealed the case, took it to the American court, to the Australian courts. There was no arbitration agreement signed, so it wasn't a matter of duress and whether the arbitration was allowed, because there was no agreement. He simply took it to court saying the Bet Din have no right to give me a Seruv. And the court ruled in accordance with him that the Dayanim were in contempt of court. In Hebrew, that's schita, something like that. They're in contempt of court, and therefore they were criminals. They were criminally liable. They are mishpat plili. So they were criminally liable and had to pay a certain amount of money as a fine, as a knas. Now this was appealed to the Supreme Court. So it was started at the Supreme Court. It was appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal in New South Wales. They upheld it, although they reduced the penalty a little bit. And there was a dissenting opinion. And I'm going to mention there's a dissenting opinion because it's relevant to discuss maybe a little bit later. It was then appealed. They tried to take it to the High Court, the Bagats of Australia, right? And the Bagats didn't allow it. So it was not given leave to appeal, and it remained. That's the precedent in Australia. So Australia, you can't. America, you can. Now I'm going to talk very just on regal achad about cats neged Bet Din Rabbani over here. Okay. Without the microphone, is that okay? Okay. So, cats neged Bet Din Rabbani, just on regal achad as well. You have over there three cases that are brought before the Bagats, all involving Bet Din that are mamlachti, that are issuing seiruvim to people who are not attending them in areas of choshen mishpat. So in areas that post Sima Amir, they can't do choshen mishpat, but at that point you still could, and they still were doing it. And the Bagats, the majority, Zamir and Dorna, both gave a psak that this was not allowed, and they gave basically two reasons. One is because they're a government body, they are subject to the principle of legality. They can only do that which the law allows them to do. And the law doesn't anywhere say that a Bet Din Rabbani can send a seiruf. Issue number two, an arbitration agreement has to be done voluntarily, right? If you don't do it voluntarily, then it is bottle or muvotol. It has no value, it's duress. So they sort of ruled in accordance with, in a sense, you could say, the Australian position. There was a dissenting opinion, Justice Tull, and I might talk about his view a little bit later. But I want to get into the analysis, which I think is the most fun. And here I want to talk about what is a סירוב and what a סירוב said, what the position of a country on a סירוב says about the country. So I'm going to argue that a סירוב is the point of tension, the fault line that exists between multiculturalism or freedom of religion and democratic principles, the ability to approach a court, which is a basic democratic principle. And the question is, when you're weighing those two things up against each other, which side do you fall on? And in order to understand this, I want to sort of take you on a little bit of a journey. It's going to be a short journey because I've got 8 minutes and 50 seconds, but it'll be a little bit of a journey. And I want to talk to you about legal pluralism. So, bבתי הדין שמעתם על legal pluralism. So, some of you, okay, good. Many of you have. I'll רגע אחת. Legal pluralism is an idea that actually only began being spoken about in the 1960s, which is exactly the same time when the word multiculturalism started being spoken about as well. And you can do a Google Books Ngram chart and look at how that word features, and you'll see both of them have the same trajectory. They start in the 1960s and they grow. It's not because legal pluralism began in the 1960s. If anything, that's when it sort of was remembered. What it was is, prior to the nation state, you had the idea that law applied more to a person's identity than it did to a territory. So you could have people living within another country who followed a different set of rules, and particularly the Jewish community. And a סירוב was a very important part of the Jewish community living in a legal pluralistic age, where they had their own governance and they were allowed to do it, but they didn't necessarily have their own ability to enforce law. They didn't have a military or police force to the extent that the state had, and the סירוב was a very powerful mechanism for a bet in those times. With the formation of the nation state, particularly at the end of the 19th century, a movement of collecting all foreign bits of judicial freedom into one legal monistic state, a legal monism, meaning a legal centrism. One single legal system was formed, and what you find then is that arbitration became something very much disliked by the courts. The courts would have a very, very negative view of the scope of an arbitrator. They didn't have arbitration was any sort of acts to enable arbitration were construed narrowly by the judges. And it was sort of the beginning of the nation state, and the idea that the judiciary is something that stands on its own and it is the only source of law. It's also linked into Jeremy Bentham's positivism, the idea that law is only that which is given in a recognizable way by the state. And as a result of that, I can't imagine bבתי הדין would have had any real power back in those days. What happened is the 1960s came with an air of a new wind of multiculturalism. And along with multiculturalism came legal pluralism, because legal pluralism is really multiculturalism in law. And what it is, it's the state starting to say, wait a second, it's not just one. There are many types of people. How can we accommodate them? And so that at that point, the arbitration acts across the world start becoming construed more broadly. And the judges start giving space to arbitration, and they start being more hands-off. And generally you find at that point, that's when you sort of move into this zone where other groups like religions, Jewish religion in particular in America, Jews are at the forefront of this, started operating with their bבתי הדין and moving into matters that are commercial, that are civil. Now, there's a big difference between multiculturalism in Australia versus America. What's the difference? The difference is, by the way, am I speaking too fast? No? Okay. The difference in America and Australia is this. America was founded as a state, as a country, when other colonies existed. So America is the combination of a number of British colonies. At this time, there were French colonies, there were Spanish colonies. Over time, they purchased or conquered those other colonies, but they respected the integrity of each colony. which means there is a musag in America that you can have different types of law within the same country. Take Louisiana, which follows civil law. It's now a hybrid of civil and common, and I'm sure that's a much bigger discussion. But America was born in a way that recognized there were others. It was born in a pluralistic manner. Australia, on the other hand, and Canada's like this as well, and so is New Zealand, they were conceived in a very different way. The British came along, they said there's no one here. They looked at the natives and they said they have no law, they have no property rights, they have nothing. And they deemed the land terra nullius, which means it is ownerless land. And they came and they basically just took it all as theirs. Australia is very strongly positivistic, it's very much influenced by Bentham, and as a result, Australia was much slower moving towards multiculturalism than America is. You find in 1967, Australia starts to recognise its Aboriginal, its natives, and it starts recognising that land was owned. But that's a much later thing, which means the multiculturalism in Australia generally is far less advanced than America. Now take a look at the סירוב with those eyes. When you're an Australian looking at a סירוב, you're looking at this religion trying to self-govern, trying to do what it can to rein in its own people. As an Australian, you have a limited tolerance for religion, and there is a separation of church and state in the Constitution, but it's read very narrowly. There's almost no real proper doctrine of how we navigate that principle. At the state level, there is no separation of church and state. And therefore, Australia is very easy to jump straight to the individual who's being harmed and say, well, we're going to protect him. Okay, there's a religion involved here. I'm not too worried. Australia courts will also get involved in a little bit of doctrine, which American courts never will. American courts have very strong religion and state and church separation, the First Amendment, and there are proper defined, polity democrats and neutral principles and all sorts of developed doctrines of how they deal with it. And the second they see a religion doing what it needs to do to govern, the gisha of the average judge will be hands off. Unless we have to go in, our first initial reaction is hands off. And that's because, in my opinion, a different form of multiculturalism in those two countries. Now, I just want to talk in the last 2 minutes about a little bit of analysis on the Israel side. So, Israel side, you're very interesting. You have Zamir and Dorna, and then you have Tal. And Tal's dissent is a very radical dissent. It's a dissent that's different to any dissent that you will find in Australia and America, in my opinion. And not only that, Zamir and Dorna's majority opinion is a radical majority, which is more radical than anything you'll find in Australia and America. I'll explain to you what I mean. Zamir and Dorna, as part of their opinion, they were mevatel the סירוב. They said this סירוב has no jurisdiction, therefore the Bet Din Rabbanit don't need to be mevatel it. There's a law that if you give a cherem, the Bet Din has to come and undo the cherem. They said there's no need for the Bet Din to do this, because we, the Bagats, are mevatel it. What does Tal say? Tal in his sense says, who are you? Ha-pesha asur hu ha-pesha hitter. The Bet Din needs to do it. You're no one. You don't exist in the world of law where these people exist. These people are mikadma dinam. They are a law that has existed for thousands of years. You are the new boys on the block. You can't go and assert that their law is illegitimate. You can say they can't do it, make them criminally liable, but don't go and say that their law never happened. Don't enter into religious doctrine, which they do. So what you have over here is almost two extremes. You have and this is, by the way, Yisachar Rosenzweig's an excellent article where he really pits them against each other. He says, you have Tal, who is basically taking an extreme view of pluralism, saying, these people exist outside of the state. And then you have Zamir and Dorna, who are taking an extreme view of positivism, saying, even religious courts are also part of the positivistic system, so much so that we can enter into any halachic decision that a religious court makes if they're mamlachti, right? Each one is taking an extreme position, and to me, you could say the Supreme Court is Australia, and Tal is like before the nation state, right? And so, but it's not even like Australia. Australia won't even go that far. So it's actually, it's more radical than Australia, and Tal is more radical than America. So Israel, in my opinion, you actually have something where you've got a greater polar than what you have in America and Australia, which are just two things along the spectrum of multiculturalism, but they're both positivistic. American courts or Australian courts both won't enter into doctrine. They both recognize that. Israel, however, is extreme positivism on one side and extreme pluralism on the other side. And I think if you understand that, it can help you understand the issue of judicial reforms and everything else that's going on in this country. That's my analysis as an outsider. So, blah, 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 blah.
Thank you very much.